I ought to have thought of that myself, but it escaped me. I confess, so far superior are your sex to ours, dear madam, in point of penetration and sagacity.' Mrs Varden looked as wise as if she had really said something to deserve this compliment, firmly believed she had, in short, and her faith in her own shrewdness increased considerably. 'My dear ma'am,' said Mr Chester, 'you embolden me to be plain with you. My son and I are at variance on this point. The young lady and her natural guardian differ upon it also, and the closing point is, that my son is bound by his duty to me, by his honour, by every solemn tie and obligation, to marry some one else.'
'Engaged to marry another lady?'
quoth Mrs Varden, holding up her hands. 'My dear madam, brought up, educated, and trained expressly for that purpose. Expressly for that purpose. Miss Haredale, I am told, is a very charming creature.'
'I am her foster mother, and should know. The best young lady in the world,' said Mrs Varden.
'I have not the smallest doubt of it. I am sure she is. And you, who have stood in that tender relation towards her, are bound to consult her happiness. Now, can I, as I have said to Haredale, who quite agrees, can I possibly stand by and suffer her to throw herself away, although she is of a Catholic family, upon a young fellow who, as yet, has no heart at all? It is no imputation upon him to say he has not, because young men who have plunged deeply into the frivolities and conventionalities of society very seldom have. Their hearts never grow, my dear ma'am, till after 30. I don't believe, no, I do not believe, that I had any heart myself when I was Ned's age.'
'Oh, sir,' said Mrs Varden, 'I think you must have had. It's impossible that you, who have so much now, can ever have been without any.'
'I hope,' he answered, shrugging his shoulders meekly, 'I have a little. I hope very little, Heaven knows. But to return to Ned. I have no doubt you thought, and therefore interfered benevolently in his behalf, that I objected to Miss Haredale. How very natural, my dear madam. I object to him. To him. Emphatically to Ned himself.' Mrs Varden was perfectly aghast at the disclosure. 'He has, if he honourably fulfils this solemn obligation of which I have told you, and he must be honourable, dear Mrs Varden, or he is no son of mine, a fortune within his reach. He is of most expensive, ruinously expensive habits, and if in a moment of caprice and wilfulness he were to marry this young lady, and so deprive himself of the means of gratifying the tastes to which he has been so long accustomed, he would, my dear madam, he would break the gentle creature's heart. Mrs Varden, my good lady, my dear soul, I put it to you, is such a sacrifice to be endured? Is the female heart a thing to be trifled with in this way? Ask your own, my dear madam, ask your own, I beseech you.' Truly, thought Mrs Varden, this gentleman is a saint.
'But,' she added aloud, and not unnaturally, 'if you take Miss Emma's lover away, sir, what becomes of the poor thing's heart then?'
'The very point,' said Mr Chester, not at all abashed, 'to which I wished to lead you. A marriage with my son, whom I should be compelled to disown, would be followed by years of misery. They would be separated, my dear madam, in a 12-month. To break off this attachment, which is more fancied than real, as you and I know very well, will cost the dear girl but a few tears, and she is happy again. Take the case of your own daughter, the young lady downstairs, who is your breathing image.' Mrs Varden coughed and simpered. 'There is a young man, I am sorry to say a dissolute fellow of very indifferent character, of whom I have heard Ned speak. Bullet, was it? Pullet, Mullet?'
'There is a young man of the name of Joseph Willet, sir,' said Mrs Varden, folding her hands loftily.
'That's he!' cried Mr Chester. 'Suppose this Joseph Willet, now, were to aspire to the affections of your charming daughter, and were to engage them.'
'It would be like his impudence,' interposed Mrs Varden, bridling, 'to dare to think of such a thing.' 'My dear madam, that's the whole case. I know it would be like his impudence. It is like Ned's impudence to do as he has done, but you would not on that account, or because of a few tears from your beautiful daughter, refrain from checking their inclinations in their birth. I meant to have reasoned thus with your husband when I saw him at Mrs Rudge's this evening.' 'My husband,' said Mrs Varden, interposing with emotion, 'would be a great deal better at home than going to Mrs Rudge's so often. I don't know what he does there. I don't see what occasion he has to busy himself in her affairs at all, sir.'
'If I don't appear to express my concurrence in those last sentiments of yours,' returned Mr Chester, 'quite so strongly as you might desire, it is because his being there, my dear madam, and not proving conversational, led me hither, and procured me the happiness of this interview with one in whom the whole management, conduct, and prosperity of her family are centred, I perceive.' With that he took Mrs Varden's hand again, and having pressed it to his lips with the high-flown gallantry of the day, a little burlesqued to render it the more striking in the good lady's unaccustomed eyes, proceeded in the same strain of mingled sophistry, cajolery, and flattery, to entreat that her utmost influence might be exerted to restrain her husband and daughter from any further promotion of Edward's suit to Miss Haredale, and from aiding or abetting either party in any way. Mrs Varden was but a woman, and had her share of vanity, obstinacy, and love of power. She entered into a secret treaty of alliance, offensive and defensive, with her insinuating visitor, and really did believe, as many others would have done who saw and heard him, that in so doing she furthered the ends of truth, justice, and morality in a very uncommon degree. Overjoyed by the success of his negotiation, and mightily amused within himself, Mr Chester conducted her downstairs in the same state as before, and having repeated the previous ceremony of salutation, which also as before comprehended Dolly, took his leave, first completing the conquest of Miss Miggs's heart by inquiring if this young lady would light him to the door.
'Oh, Mim!'
said Miggs, returning with the candle.
'Oh, gracious me, Mim! There's a gentleman! Was there ever such an angel to talk as he is, and such a sweet looking man, so upright and noble that he seems to despise the very ground he walks on, and yet so mild and condescending that he seems to say, but I will take notice on it too. And to think of his taking you for Miss Dolly, and Miss Dolly for your sister! Oh, my goodness me! If I was master, wouldn't I be jealous of him!'
Mrs Varden reproved her handmaid for this vain speaking, but very gently and mildly, quite smilingly indeed, remarking that she was a foolish, giddy, light-headed girl, whose spirits carried her beyond all bounds, and who didn't mean half she said, or she would be quite angry with her. 'For my part,' said Dolly in a thoughtful manner, 'I half believe Mr Chester is something like Miggs in that respect. For all his politeness and pleasant speaking, I am pretty sure he was making game of us more than once.' 'If you venture to say such a thing again, and to speak ill of people behind their backs in my presence, miss,' said Mrs Varden, 'I shall insist upon your taking a candle and going to bed directly. How dare you, Dolly? I'm astonished at you.
The rudeness of your whole behaviour this evening has been disgraceful.